Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk, I think, for roughly half an hour, and I'm going to talk quite quickly and then leave some time for questions. And what I want to do is to try and introduce what practical criticism is in Cambridge, because it's a rather specific Cambridge English institution or type of study. So I want to try and demystify it a bit and explain what we do when we do practical criticism. Partly to give a hint of what I think is distinctive and exciting about the Cambridge English course, but also to hopefully suggest some interesting things about poetry and writing. And if, at the end of all of this, if there are questions you want to ask that aren't practical criticism related, but just about English studies from the point of view of directive studies and interviews and whatnot, then there'll be a little bit of time for those questions too, I hope. So what is practical criticism? Well, in a sense, the starting point is to try and analyze texts in a way that doesn't rely on the kinds of practices and methods that people usually use when they're reading. So in a weekly kind of process of studying literature or in life generally, people often race through lots of texts or read quickly or read for plot or narrative. But in a way, what we do in practical criticism is to slow down the process and think much more slowly and carefully about what might be going on in a small amount of material. So the characteristic rhythm of the Cambridge study is lots of reading for your essay, lots of kind of investigation into a whole range of materials, but then there's weekly exercise in taking only a small bit of text and slowing it down and thinking quite carefully about what might be in play. Part of the history of this comes from the beginnings of English as a subject of study in Cambridge, where it was clear to people teaching it that students didn't really know what to do with poems or texts or the analysis of bits of writing unless they were told who they were by, what they were, contextually expected to say, and they would essentially read the name of the author into the text rather than read what was there in front of them. And this exercise, in its early form, was done anonymously without the name of the author or the name of the context from which it was published or the date or historical context, all of that removed to try and kind of say, well, look at the writing rather than read into it what you would expect from information like who it was by. So we've got two texts here, and this would be a classic practical criticism thing, to compare two texts that might be in dialogue, and we might think, has one informed the other, or how does it look if we compare the two of these texts? To make it slightly easier to follow, I've broken the text down so that we don't have to read them on that small screen. This is London. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. And then the other poem, Impression du matin, Impression du matin. The Thames nocturne of blue and gold changed to a harmony in grey. A barge with ochre-coloured hay dropped from the wharf, and chill and cold the yellow fog came creeping down the bridges till the houses' walls seemed changed to shadows, and St. Paul's loomed like a bubble o'er the town. Then suddenly arose the clang of waking life, the streets were stirred with country wagons, and a bird flew to the glistening roofs and sang. But one pale woman, all alone, the daylight kissing her wan hair, loitered beneath the gas lamp's flare with lips of flame and heart of stone. So, in the traditional kind of practical criticism mode, we would look at these two texts and start to think about them. We might even ask a question like whether we preferred one or other or what we thought was different about them. But I'm going to give you some starting points to think about, and then try and kind of work into some discussion of what we might do with these texts. In a sense, the question that we start with is what happens when we remove the name of the writers and then add some paratextual information later. What might we learn if we knew the author and date of these poems? What might we do with the title and the way in which the title sits in some relation to the rest of the poem or the body of the poem? What might we think about in relation to the structure of address, the I or you of the poem? And how might we go about thinking about what's going on with the rhyme, the meter, the line endings and lineation? And how might we think about grammar? Are there some particularly interesting noun or verb or adjectival forms and so on and so forth? Might we notice something about the punctuation structure and think, oh, there's an argument in the way in which this poem has punctuation? Or is that just an accident of print history in the way in which it was published? What might we think are the idioms and idiolects of these texts, their unusual words or phrases? What are the ideological contexts and arguments? Well, to speed things along, I want to kind of give you some background information. We can think about what it would mean to be reading these poems without this information as well as with it. So, London is a poem by William Blake, published in Songs of Experience in 1794. Critics have suggested the poem is overshadowed by the French Revolution and that the poem bears witness to dangerous industrial conditions, child labour, prostitution and poverty. Impression du matin is a poem by Oscar Wilde, published in Wilde's Poems of 1881. And critics have suggested the poem moves through an impressionist riverscape that bears affinities with the paintings of James McNeill Whistler to sketch a critical landscape of industrial London and, again, prostitution. For those of you who don't know anything about them, William Blake, born 1757, died 1827, English poet, painter and printmaker. Largely unrecognised during his life, Blake is now considered a seminal figure in the history of English poetry and visual art, and he lived in London for almost his entire life. Oscar Wilde, born 1854, died 1900, relatively young, you'll notice, was an Irish poet and playwright. Writing in different forms in the 1880s, he became a popular London playwright in the early 1890s, and he was famously imprisoned for gross indecency for consensual homosexual acts in a much publicised celebrity trial. So now we've got that information, let's go back to London. What here are the marks that we might notice that would make us go, oh, I see, this is a William Blake poem from 1794. What happens if we think about that information and then try and bracket it out? Let's look a little bit more carefully at the first 8 lines. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. Well, we've got a powerful I here, and we could wonder whether that I was really the I of London. Is this the voice of London, or is this the voice of a poet wandering through the chartered streets? And we could notice, I think, the way in which the lines have a certain kind of rhythmic flow, and that's matched by the street meet, flow, woe, man, ban, fear, here. But there are some little things that we might pick up on that are a bit more peculiar. Notice the way in which the word man lurks in manacles. And we might wonder how far this poem is thinking about man as a gendered thing rather than as man as the human condition or the humankind more generally. Is this a male I that has the right to wander? But then I think we might alight on the word chartered and wonder quite what's important about this word that it needs to be repeated. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow. Let's have a look at the next 8 lines. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So notice the cry, sigh, appalls walls, hear, tear, curse, hearse, the rhyme scheme working on the right-hand line. But if you've got your wits about you and you're reading the left-hand column as well, you'll notice that how every and spells here, that there's a little acrostic at the beginning of each line which spells out the word here. And we might wonder how far Blake expects us to see these words as opposed to hearing them, and what the relationship between marks that we hear and marks that we read might be all about. Let's go back to that word charter. What is the meaning of this in a kind of more social sense? Here's a glimpse from Dr. Johnson's Dictionary of 1755, suggesting that a charter is a written evidence between men and man, very powerfully gendered here in this description as something between men. Charters are divided into charters of the king and charters of private persons. Charters of the king are those whereby the king passeth any grant to any person or more to any body politic. So there's a kind of sense in which it comes from the authority of the crown. If you compare that with the more recent Oxford English definition, Oxford English Dictionary definition, it's a slightly more kind of urbane, perhaps, way of putting it, slightly less polemically charged. A written document delivered by the sovereign or legislature. So somehow in this poem we need to think about chartered streets and chartered Thames. What does it mean that a certain kind of sovereign legislature has written its document into the streets of the very river of the Thames? I think the more we think about this, the more I think we sense that Blake is troubled by the way in which the streets and the very river have been chartered under the authority of the king. And if you recall my sense that this poem was overshadowed by the French Revolution, there's a question about who has the right to charter the river that runs through the city. And then we start to think about the politics of the poem. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thameses flow and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. This is a depressed, dark city. Every man, every infant, every voice, every ban, all caught up in mind-forged manacles. And in a world in which the blackening church stands for a doubleness. This would be an interesting example of a grammatical kind of tension where the church is blackening both on the outside in the sense that it's making the world blacker, but also its walls are in some way blackening and require chimney sweepers. Even the soldiers offer sighs that run in blood down palace walls, and then suddenly the chartered meets the politics of the church and the palace as the two central forms of authority that the poem is obliquely challenging. And there is this curse that lurks in the poem, which blasts newborn infants with the thought of blight and plagues, a word that has new meaning in the land of COVID. The idea of marriage being a hearse, a complicated little combination of two words in which the death chariot of the hearse is somehow allied to marriage in the way in which the culture of prostitution in London blights newborn children with a kind of literal and a metaphorical plague. Well, if we think about the larger context, this poem is first published and looks like this. I've got two versions of the poem. This is one and this is another. You can see that they're slightly different. They're different ways in colour. So these are hand illuminated by Blake and appear in kind of print forms in London and are not straightforwardly printed so much as drawn. So we're moving into a kind of visual world rather than a straightforwardly printed one, in which how we see the poem and how we hear it are explicitly kind of part of the texture of the way in which it was first published. You can perhaps see this if you zoom in on the little creature warming its hand on the fire and look at the way in which looking at these words is suddenly a more visual experience than reading print. It's always kind of a subtle question, Blake, how much it's a critique of the way in which print culture itself is chartered and how much he's just producing his own peculiar and fascinating combination of image and text. Let's turn with some of these thoughts kind of resonating to the wild. You've heard me struggle with impression du matin. How do we say that? Well, it's in some way French, and there's a peculiar kind of sense in which the title sits awkwardly in relation to the actual poem. The Thames nocturne of blue and gold changed to a harmony in grey. A barge with ochre-coloured hay dropped from the wharf, and chill and cold the yellow fog came creeping down. Well, even as I read it, let's look at that more, the first 8 lines more carefully. You can see that the lines flow more kind of gently over each other, and that the rhyme scheme is slightly less pointed in terms of the way in which the words come out. The Thames nocturne of blue and gold changed to a harmony in grey. a barge with ochre-coloured hay dropped from the wharf, and chill and cold the yellow fog came creeping down. It doesn't quite have that end-stopped quality. But there's a rhyme scheme, gold, cold, grey, hay, slightly different in the way in which it works because it's a kind of 1-4-2-3 rather than 1-3-2-4 kind of pattern. And that we can see how this pattern of what we see and what we hear and what we're reading are kind of in some way operating on different sensory levels of perception. Then suddenly arose the clang of waking life. The streets were stirred with country wagons, and a bird flew to the glistening roofs and sang. But one pale woman all alone, the daylight kissing her worn hair, loitered beneath the gas lamp's flare, with lips of flame and heart of stone. Well, there's a pattern here of concluding with the stricken world of the streetwalker, the harlot's curse, but here a pale woman all alone. It seems difficult to imagine any other explanation for why this pale woman would be all alone in the morning gaslight loitering if they weren't a streetwalker. But they have lips of flame and heart of stone. And there's a kind of political implication to this. If we compare the visual appearance of how the poem was first published, this is what it looks like in 1881. And you can see a slightly different left-hand margin that draws attention to that 1-4-2-3 structure, and various other features of the poem which you might wonder about in relation to whether it was St. Paul's and what happened to the T, and little details about how the spelling and punctuation work. You might also turn to this text and think, and you could come across this on Wikisource, and it's described as the original manuscript of the poem. But what you might notice there is that it's slightly different, that the poem looks shorter. It says, "To my friend Luther Monday" at the top. You perhaps can't read it very easily. And down the bottom it says 91. And if you look at what the poem suggests, there are certain features about this that are peculiar. What I think you'll discover if you think about that 91 is that this can't be the original manuscript of the poem because it's written after the poem is published in print. And that we would be mistaken in believing Wikisource as in its statement this is the original manuscript, because clearly it isn't. We will be on stronger ground in thinking about what the poem means by nocturne. If you compare that with chartered and think, what's this nocturne, the Thames nocturne of blue and gold? Nocturne painting is a term coined by James McNeill Whistler to describe a painting style that depicts scenes evocative of the night. And Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket, is a painting by Whistler first shown in the Grosvenor Gallery in London in 1877. It's one of the two works, the other being Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Fire Wheel, inspired by the Cremorne Gardens, a celebrated pleasure resort in London. Whistler's depiction of the industrial city park's fireworks in the foggy night sky is most famously known as the inception of the lawsuit between Whistler and the art critic John Ruskin. This is what Whistler's Nocturne in Black and Gold looks like. You can't really see it on a small screen, but you get a sense of what it might be. And this is another poem, Nocturne Blue and painting Nocturne Blue and Gold, Old Battersea Bridge. And if you remember from the poem, we have Thames Nocturne of Blue and Gold. So this poem appears at least to be open to the suggestion that it's alluding to these paintings, and perhaps this painting in particular, but not straightforwardly citing them so we go, it's about those paintings, but as part of the atmosphere of what the poem is arguing. Nocturne Blue and Gold, Old Battersea Bridge is a painting by James McNeill Whistler, painted around 1875, so in the period when Wilde wrote the poem. The painting is of the old wooden Battersea Bridge across the River Thames before it was replaced. Whistler's Nocturne series achieved notoriety in 1877 when Ruskin wrote of the exhibition of these paintings that Whistler was asking 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. Whistler sued, and the court the case reached the courts in 1878, and the judge apparently sincerely asked Whistler which part of the picture is the bridge. The case ended with Whistler awarded token damages of 1 farthing. But this painting, Nocturne Blue and Gold, Old Battersea Bridge, is very much in the news, a much debated and discussed painting between two very significant figures in the history of British art, John Ruskin and Whistler. So we go back to the poem armed with this information, and now we can see that there's a rather different poem emerging, one in which the question of the visible, the visual world of the arts is being thought about in the context of a kind of dramatic lyric. The Thames Nocturne of blue and gold changed to a harmony in grey. We've moved from the notion of a night painting in blue and gold, one that might be the pleasure gardens in the night, to a harmony in grey, the impression of morning. So a kind of critical evocation of an impressionist type of painting, but with this change to a harmony in grey, the world of print, and a different musical term in the word harmony. And see how this is worked out in the poem. A barge with ochre-coloured hay dropped from the wharf. So we imagine a barge putting hay into the Thames world, and chill and cold, the yellow fog came down the bridges till the houses' walls seemed changed to shadows, and St. Paul's loomed like a bubble over the town. We're getting a visual world, but in the clang of this waking life of the morning, there is this pale woman with the daylight kissing her worn hair. And all these words suddenly seem charged in terms of how we imagine the significance of what we picture and what the politics of the existence of this creature might be all about. The daylight kissing her worn hair loitered beneath the gas lamp's flare. So the contrast between gas lamps and daylight as a kind of harmony in grey, which would be two paintings rather than one, were there to be a painting of this scene. We can imagine this scene as a critique of the Whistler painting, in the style of the Whistler painting, but in a very different culture of visual thinking from that associated with the Blake. So I'm nearly done, but let's go back to the beginning and think, what have we managed to discover? If you look at these two poems initially, you might not quite have this sense of the politics and of the visual culture behind them. But I think you can see how they draw attention to themselves as a certain kind of poem about visual landscaping and thinking. And that adding this information back in confirms our sense that these are things that are there in the text rather than things that we've simply projected. So that the insistence of the chartered street is doubled, and the mark in every face and the marks of weakness. What does it mean to mark a face as opposed to hear something, and then turning towards hearing the youthful harlot's curse and imagining what the significance of that world might all be about? The movement through the sense perceptions is structured in quite a kind of explicit and careful way in terms of how we hear the mind-forged manacles and then see the consequences of them. And similarly in the wild, there's a kind of sense in which we would move from a kind of apparently sort of glossy visual nocturne associated with a certain kind of painting that might be imagining as sort of celebrating the city of London, but has a different sense of the yellow fog that comes creeping down. That yellow fog, which becomes a persistent feature of London description from the mid-19th century right the way through to the Clean Air Acts of the 1960s, is associated with a kind of industrial miasma of pollution, what Ruskin called the storm cloud of the 19th century, where Ruskin, a very fine art critic, who observed through his life that the fog in London had got yellower, that the clouds of London and of England had become yellow under industrial pollution. And he observed this by using a painter's eye for looking at the clouds. And Wilde is working with this argument between Ruskin and Whistler to think about the yellow fog of the industrial city coming down on the world of daylight and the pale woman loitering in the gas lamp's flare. If you compare that with the hints of industrialization associated with the chimney sweeper, in Blake's London there's also an early sense of the industrial smog of the blackening church, where the church is becoming blacker according to the industrial soot and smells of the city as they kind of blacken and darken the walls of the church. But there's also a kind of clear sense in which Blake is critical of the way in which the church is complicit in the chartering of the Thames, and the way in which St. Paul's might be at the centre of that is kind of implicit in the kind of world of London. So we can kind of see how some of the background information is kind of backed up by this close reading. And we might then ask this final question to think about what's going on in this process of thinking through practical criticism as to whether Wilde means us to understand that he's in dialogue also with Blake's poem. Now, this is where we get to a kind of really interesting scholarly question. We don't know whether Wilde sat down and wrote Impressions du Matin with London at his desk and thought, I'll do my version of London. But it's difficult when you put the two together not to imagine some kind of dialogue between them. It's possible that dialogue is of our own invention and that it's merely me putting the two texts together that makes us see it that way. But I'm drawn to the thought that we have at least the possibility that Wilde was thinking about the London of Blake and what it would mean to reconstruct that texture in relation to a poem written many years later. And one feature of this that I think is kind of marked and interesting, which I hope you've noticed, I haven't drawn attention to it until now, is the way in which London in Blake's construction is centered around the figure of the eye, an eye that wanders through each chartered street, that might make us think about the lyric eye, the eye of the voice of the poet, but also the eye that we could imagine as a sight kind of organ, what it means to see with the eye. I wandered through each chart, and it's a very much centered around an eye that does the meeting, the hearing, and the construction of a person at the center of the poem. Whereas in Wilde's poem, it's strangely without an eye, and there's no clear sense of the lyric persona of the poet. It's more the description of a kind of narrative perspective in world, but we can't quite find the I in there. And the joke here perhaps is that Oscar Wilde famously said of Whistler, whose paintings I think he's partly thinking about, that Whistler spelt art always with a capital I, and had a sense that Whistler's art for art's sake was always really about Whistler rather than about art. And that the meaning of the word I in this poem, I think, is partly this critical understanding of what it means to take the I, the person of the poet, out of the poem and imagine the voice of the people described, not in the voice of the poet, but in the voice of a kind of linguistic description, which is about writing and about painting and about music and seeing and thinking. So what have we learned from this? Well, I'm hoping you get a glimpse of how practical criticism might start to unpick a poem that you think, I can make sense of this, but then it gradually gathers depth and you begin to realize the dialogue and the possibilities of two poems put together. But also how it opens up historical questions where you might go, well, I'm quite interested in the politics of the Thames and eco-criticism and the whole idea of the ecology of how pollution has been registered in poems about London. That's one of the reasons why I've been thinking about these poems. What point do people writing about London sense the kind of future of climate change and the impact of it? And poems are very sensitive registers of the way in which the politics of ecology have been gradually beginning to inform our sense of what London and the climate of Britain is like. So we could be kind of moving between close reading and a kind of much larger ecological argument. We could be thinking about the politics of gender in relation to what's going on in this culture of prostitution and children and the curse of blights and plagues associated with prostitution in London and street walking in London, and the extent to which men have the right to walk the street, whereas a street walker woman is in a very different political situation. The politics of this have clearly changed, but these are also kind of registering some of the politics of gender in relation to what it means to walk around in London. How safe is it? Who polices it? Do we feel comfortable in a place like London walking around at night or in the morning after a night out? We might also be thinking about the politics of this in relation to a kind of sense of the songs of London. How do we hear London? How do we think about London as a musical environment? How do we think of it as a visual environment? Most people in Britain have an imagination associated with London. In fact, London globally has an imaginative power. Even if you've never lived in London, you're kind of obliged to think about this London. But I think there's a very interesting sense in which songs of London are being thought about by both these poems, but also paintings of London, what it would mean for art to think critically about London. And we might, through all of that, start to think about the ideological arguments that Blake and Wilde are interested in as critical figures who are anti-establishment in various ways. So I'm going to stop just abruptly there and invite questions.
Thanks for that, Drew. I was gripped. Yeah, I could listen to you talk about poetry all day, I think. We have to get a podcast with you going. So one of the questions has come in straight away. I don't know if you can see it, but it's, what are your thoughts on the concept of the death of the author, in that an author's intention should be disconnected entirely from the analysis of the words on the page? Or would you say that the author's intentions are always central to the analysis?
I wouldn't myself say that the author's intentions are central to the analysis, but I can't myself get rid of the idea that they might be of some interest. So I think it's important, and I think this is where the expression death of the author comes from. There's a sense in which when Roland Barthes proposes the death of the author, what he's interested in is changing the way we think about texts and moving away from the notion that we read everything according to the author's name and personality as though it was an expression of them, and look at the actual text. And in a sense, that's what I've been doing. I could have talked more about Blake, but I haven't really talked about Blake's intentions. But I've tried to reconstruct some of his activity as an artist and as a writer, as a poet. And we could speculate on what Blake's intentions were, but in a way we'd be doing the same thing, which is reading the poem. So I don't think we're ever going to get to the writer's intentions. I write myself, and I know that writers bluff and lie about their work and tell you all kinds of porkies. So you can't trust an author when they describe their intentions. You can only read what they do and think about their work. So I think there's a very important intervention that Barthes makes with the concept of the death of the author, which is to suspend or displace the authority or the theology of the author. Really what he's interested in is the notion of the author as God, and to take that away and think what would it mean to democratize texts in a way that aren't about some theology of the godlike author, but not in the end to ignore the way in which writers think, which is the sort of parody version of the death of the author, which sort of imagines that it's actually killing off authors, which is quite the opposite. The death of the author is the birth of the text and the idea of the possibility of writing, rather than that we would get rid of authors.
Ocean asks, what is your opinion on the notion that poets subconsciously filter themselves and or their personal context into their own poetry?
Filter is an interesting word. There's an important kind of tradition which I come from, which is interested in what it means to democratize and radicalize the resources of poetry, that wants to say that the impersonality of the poem or the song is what really matters, not the personality of the writer. So this process of bracketing your personality is important for being a writer. There's somebody who goes around thinking, I am a writer, I think is not writing, and is obviously suffering from a kind of delusion. In the act of writing, it seems to me you lend your energies to the possibilities of writing, the social kind of possibilities. So I suppose I think all poets are in danger of not filtering themselves enough out of the poem to make it a poem. If you imagine writing a great song, we don't really want it to be an expression of who the songwriter. We want it to be a song that will live for everybody. And in that sense, I hope that writers learn to filter effectively. But you can't deny the personality of people and the way in which they're engaged in the politics of who they are and what they do. And we argue passionately about that.
Hallam asks, in regards to practical analysis, what are the best ways which you would recommend to practice? So someone thinking about starting to do a little bit themselves, what's the best way that they can practice?
Well, I gave a little kind of list of things. When I'm teaching practical criticism, I tell people to kind of think about what they think is most unusual about the text that they're looking at. So that which forces you to think, what have I read that's a bit like it, or what do I think is distinctive? So rather than going, oh, I've spotted a rhyme scheme, think what's odd about this rhyme scheme, or what's the strangest word? That's why I focused on chartered or nocturne. They're strange little words. What do we do with them? So I would say read with an eye for the things that surprise you or make you think, I don't know what that's about. I'm always interested in what you want to look up when you read a poem. So in the way in which practical criticism is taught, we don't necessarily have Google and Wikipedia or whatever it is at our fingertips. And certainly in an examination context, we might not have. So the question is, what do we do with our thinking skills when we can't look things up? But what is it that we want to look up is quite an interesting question. So I think reading with an eye for what you want to look up when you read something, or what you rely on from the internet as a kind of information database. What does it mean to rely on that kind of stuff when you read? In terms of kind of simpler ways of thinking about it, I recommend reading anthologies of poetry, reading anthologies of prose, just kind of sampling stuff and kind of thinking, what are the varieties of things? So that when somebody produces a text for you to think about, you can go, oh, I've seen something a bit like this. I've got some way of orienting myself to this.
Alice just wants to go back to the discussion about intention. And she says, do you think that we can ever truly understand literature? So if we can never fully get to the author's intention, and if we can't, what is it about poetry that so attracts us to it?
Well, what would we? I'm not quite sure I understand what we'd be trying to get back to. If you imagine that the story of Oscar Wilde's poem might involve all kinds of complicated and interesting dialogues. Whistler was his friend, so the reference to the Whistler painting I don't think is, I think it's there, but it's subtle. It's not like it's in your face. But Wilde fell out with Whistler. And Wilde was also a friend of Ruskin. So there's a kind of three-way dialogue. And I think the poem stages some possibilities for us thinking about that, that is a gift to future generations in terms of what they think about these issues and how they would negotiate them. So rather than going back to the author, which is a very curious idea in itself, I mean, it makes, which if you think about the author God idea, it's sort of like what we might, if we were reading the Bible, need to go back to God's intentions in the Bible. But it's not obvious if you're reading a democratic text that we need to do anything other than move forward with it and see what we can do with it now. And there might be a tension between those two things, but I'm very keen on moving forward and thinking, how can texts work with us, think with them now? That's why I'm interested in poems as a register of climate change politics and the way in which we might think about politics of gender, politics of the environment of a place like London. What resources do we have for thinking about that? So I think poetry provides, and other kinds of writing too, I just happen to have been talking about poetry today, gives us tools for thinking about how we understand music, painting, language, all kinds of ways of relating to the world in ways that when we find the right resources, suddenly we've got living tools that we can use to think about the world rather than authors. So I suppose I kind of think that the authors get less and less significant. And they sort of get closer and closer to being anonymous presences in their own work. And it's the writing that survives, not the author.
Mm. That's interesting because someone asked a question about Beowulf and Gawain, and obviously we don't know who wrote them, but you're sort of saying, we've got the text and that's really the most important thing in sort of, terms of practical criticism. We don't necessarily need to know who wrote a text.
No, it would be strange not to be curious, though. So I'm not suggesting that we would ignore what information we've got. If we had a little diary by the author Beowulf saying, "I got up this morning and wrote Beowulf," we'd be all over it and reading it and thinking, "Wow, what interesting material." So anything that might be part of a discussion might turn out to be really interesting. But in some kind of critical dialogue that might not be the only thing that we'd be interested in. So if you read poems thinking, what is the future of poetry in relation to climate change? If poetry had nothing to say about climate change, we'd need to find other things that would help us with that argument. And that's an urgent contemporary political social argument, one that I'm committed to having through poetry rather than thinking, but as it turns out, when you look, poems have been registering it for longer than people recognize, and that it's actually the yellow fog of industrialization is sitting there in a poem, not quite noticed because people aren't quite alive to these things in the way that poets often are.
Yeah. Ema asks, do you believe that context is the predominant factor behind analyzing poetry?
Not really, because it's the poems that invite you to create the context that you want to work with. So if you kind of find yourself thinking, what is this word nocturne all about? Nocturne, if you just Google nocturne blue and gold, you'll discover this whole debate about a painting called Nocturne Blue and Gold by a friend of Oscar Wilde. Think, oh, so that's what it's about. So in a way, the poem kind of says, if you're curious, you might find this context and sort of start thinking with it. I don't think the context then determines the poem. It's the poem that's kind of set up the conversation. So in a sense, conversations can go all kinds of directions. We could be talking about London English and the extent to which these poems don't really have the voices of Londoners in them or something else. We could have put completely different context to it. I've just put some that seem to me to be interestingly kind of suggestive in relation to things that when you go back to the poem, turns out that they're there after all, rather than that you've just put them there.
So someone asks, as a writer yourself, would you argue that language that is chosen subconsciously by a poet merits just as much analysis as language that is chosen consciously?
Yes.
And why?
Because poets don't know quite what they're doing. They if you imagine it by analogy with music, I'm strongly of the belief that poetry isn't quite the rational art that critics often make it into. That the process by which poetry is composed and discussed and thought about are kind of working with levels of language that we find very difficult to get to consciously. So the idea of a conscious relationship to language, I think, is difficult. If I say the word London, what does it mean to you? I remember the first time I went to London vividly. I'm Scottish, so London means all kinds of things to me in relation to where I'm from and how I hear that word. Some of that's conscious, some of that's subconscious, but I don't know what you think or anyone else thinks about London quite that way, that it all echoes around. So I'd have thought even a simple place name is not going to be straightforwardly resolved into terms of conscious and subconscious moods and evocations. London's such a tricky word for that kind of process and thinking.
Um, So this is a longer question from Lucy, so bear with me. So she says that Wilde himself said that critics are worshippers as art as goddess. Would you argue that critics have too much monopoly over an author's intentions and attempt to boast of their own intelligence, or are helpful in aiding our understanding of a text and to help make complex ideas more accessible?
Well, there are lots of different kinds of critics. So, in the world that Oscar Wilde was writing, there wasn't the university study of English poetry in the way that there is now. So you'd have to think about the history of that problem. Oscar Wilde could have done with a few critics defending him at more than one occasion in situations where he was attacked for being an outrageously good writer in all kinds of fascinating, interesting ways. Quite how we would defend Oscar Wilde and think through critically some of his difficulties, I think, is a big and open question. From my point of view, there are critics who are not great. There are critics who are dull, tedious, try and contextualize or domesticate poetry into something boring. And that, in my experience, I was very put off poetry by the way it was taught to me at school. I had a life of poetry associated with playing in bands, singing songs, caring about lyrics, loving kind of poems and all kinds of things, and none of it was coming through my school context. And it was possible to think about those things in university in a way that just wasn't for me at school. School killed poetry as far as I could see. So for me, saving poetry from the way in which it had been killed was an important part of what university English was about. There are other things. I've got things similarly polemical to say about plays and the way in which plays work differently in the context of studying English at university. But to the extent that nearly everybody in this meeting today will have lots of lyrics that they know by heart associated with songs that they love, and the relation that love for songs, how that would then relate to the study of what goes on in GCSE and A-level English, it's a very sad gap that we're denied access to the resources of song and lyric and the words that we might kind of treasure as the songs of our life. So to the extent that I think that it's necessary for critics to defend the possibilities of song and poetry against a certain kind of educational deadness, yes, but then, of course, many of them are involved in education, so run the risk of being another form of educational deadness. So we need a democratic culture of poetry that doesn't rely on critics. And in some respects, we have that with pop music. People care passionately about pop songs, but they don't generally consult critics for whether they think the lyrics of X or Y are any good. They battle it out with their friends and say, that's naff, that's cheesy, that's terrible, and discuss lyrics. Maybe they discuss the tunes rather than the words, but that culture of discussing pop songs blissfully, well, maybe blissfully is not quite the right word. I'm grateful that there's less academic nonsense about pop songs to spoil it. But that doesn't mean to say there couldn't be some very interesting arguments about how to think about pop songs that we were yet to have, and we need better critics to do that. So there's a whole world of kind of things that are happening, that have been happening in culture for some time, that are difficult for academic environments to catch up with. And thinking about pop music and pop songs in relation to the history of lyric, I think, is one of those things. There are lots of others, history of slavery, history of ecology, history of gender, all kinds of things that are active kind of questions for my colleagues in terms of what we think the future of literary criticism is all about.
A slightly more light-hearted question possibly for you, Drew, is do you have a favorite poem or poetry or collection of poems?
I'm very fond of the American poet Frank O'Hara. Maybe if I write that, can I write in the chat?
I can drop that in the chat for you, Drew.
Who's a late discovery for me. I didn't know him when I was much younger, but I've come to really like Frank O'Hara. And Shakespeare, I mentioned him earlier. Was in a way the poet who taught me early on that he was maddeningly good. And I tried really hard to dislike the fact that Shakespeare was a cultural authority figure who was kind of somehow what I was supposed to like. And I've don't believe in telling anyone what they should like. But teaching Shakespeare and indeed Frank O'Hara has taught me that they are very rewarding to read, whatever else the arguments about them are. They kind of make me feel alive in ways that are special. I also have a deep love for poets like Emily Dickinson. We could go on, but I would start with Emily Dickinson, Frank O'Hara, and Shakespeare if I was, and in a sense, you can make your own mind up about where you go. Keats is another poet I think is extraordinary, but in a sense, he's also very Shakespearean. There are lots of ways into poetry. There's a lot of it. It's not taught well in schools. I would be very surprised unless you're very lucky and have a teacher who's got good understanding of how to make poetry come alive. I'd be very surprised if most people on this call haven't had a rather dismal experience of poetry at school. But that doesn't reflect the history of poetry. There's so much of it that's interesting. And I'm mainly a drama person. Talking about poetry.
Ben asks, do you think that the label of literature and also by extension, I suppose, sort of the critics of literature, do you think that the notion of pretentiousness that comes with it has detracted from the common value of poetry?
I'm not sure if I'd put it quite that way. The invention of the category of literature in the 18th century is that recent, is partly to acknowledge the rise of the novel and the way in which writing that isn't poetry might not be poetry, because traditionally up to that point you talk about poetry and plays would be poetry. So there's a movement from poetics to literature, which is partly about recognition about new forms like the novel and partly a democratization. So in some respects, there's a version of literature that wants to democratize the argument and not have an aristocratic idea of who determines what literature is, so that literature stands for a new middle class conception of what literature might be about. But in other respects, it is anti the literature of the people. So there's a kind of sense in which the category of literature is used to say this is the good stuff. It's not aristocratic and it's not populist. And that positions it as a very middle class project. And one of the things that's significant about the way we study English in Cambridge is that it's English writing we just study. We don't study English literature. Literature isn't the category that we use. It floats around, but we don't have a notion of the literary canon, that middle class canon of what you ought to read. We open up the question of writing from all kinds of angles. So in that sense, somebody who wants to kind of look at the writing of the Chartists or the writing of people who are not normally thought of as literary, that's very much open for question. So what counts as literature is a question for most critics. The people who don't think like this are the middle class snobs who want to say X text isn't literary and kind of offer a value judgment without an argument. The point about practical criticism is, well, show us the argument and we'll work out whether we think it's got any traction or power and make up our own mind. So there's a powerful sense in which practical criticism is say, don't just accept taste from somebody else, challenge it and criticize it. And in that sense, I think most critics are more skeptical about the meaning of literature than the reading public that thinks that they ought to read what they're supposed to read. And the people who think like that tend to be literary snobs of one kind or another. There are critics who think like that too, but most critics, I think, are critical of that way of thinking about literariness.
Yeah, and just it's important to note as well that you apply for English at Cambridge, not English literature.
Yeah.
I mean, the clue is in the title.
Writing in English, all kinds of it, including philosophy or writing about art or diaries or essays or letters. It's not it really isn't a subject. We study texts that most people would recognize as literary, but it's not part of the definition of what we do. And given that it's student-centered, what you study, if you said I want to study this kind of writing, that's very much something that's open.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time, Drew, and so I'll just say, is there anything else that you'd just like to leave the people who, I mean, apologies if we haven't got around to answering your questions, but is there anything else you wanted to sort of like a final thought for anyone watching?
I mentioned in the earlier session that neither of my parents went to university, and I kind of want to kind of suggest that that's partly what's motivating some of the politics of what I've been saying, which is that Cambridge is not what it's often perceived to be. It's not. Most of my colleagues are who teach in the English faculty and in corpus are very passionate about opening up literature to arguments that are not part of the kind of middle class literary snobbery that people often imagine is what Cambridge stands for. It really doesn't. Cambridge has been the centre of a radical critique of that kind of use of literature since its inception 100 years ago as a sort of place of study of English rather than English literature. So the radical traditions of Cambridge criticism and Cambridge scholarship are about opening up the question of writing to a much more radical and democratic possible society than is recognised from the outside. And to the extent that's what people are trying to do when they teach English at corpus, but also in the faculties large, it's not. And this makes it very different from Oxford, which is a much more traditional literary kind of approach to the study of English. Very different from UCL, very different from a lot of places. It's much more interested in this critical, radical democracy that I've been hinting at than you might imagine if you thought, oh, Cambridge, it'll be full of kind of traditional conservative kind of literary snobs. It really isn't. So I encourage you, if you're excited by the idea of a radical democratic possibility for literature, to think, we want you.
Okay, thanks. What a lovely. I might steal some. I'm going to steal that for another one of my talks. Thank you on behalf of everyone, Drew. Thank you very much for giving up your time for the talk and also for answering our questions. Thank you.